Top 1. The Eleusinian Mysteries. For nearly 2,000 years, the most powerful men in the ancient world traveled to a small Greek town, walked into a chamber, and experienced something that every single one of them refused to describe. Not because it was forgettable, but because they said it was the most important thing that had ever happened to them. And the penalty for disclosure was death. The town was Eleusis, 22 kilometers west of Athens, now partly buried under a modern industrial complex. The ceremony held there was called the Eleusinian Mysteries, and it ran without interruption from approximately 1500 BCE until the Roman Emperor Theodosius forcibly closed the sanctuary in 392 CE. That is a documented continuous run of nearly 1,800 years. Plato attended, Cicero attended, Marcus Aurelius attended, Plutarch attended, possibly Alexander the Great. These were not credulous men. These were the architects of Western civilization, and not one of them ever said what happened inside. Cicero wrote in De Legibus that Athens had given humanity nothing greater than the mysteries, specifically because they taught initiates how to live with joy and how to die with better hope. Pindar, in a surviving fragment, wrote that initiates saw the end of life and its God-sent beginning, language that implies not theatrical drama, but an encounter with death itself. The initiation hall, the telesterion, measured approximately 54 meters by 52 meters, large enough to hold 3,000 people simultaneously. That architectural scale implies the coordinated management of a mass shared experience, not a private mystical revelation. The ritual drink consumed during initiation was called the kykeon. It is described in the Homeric hymn to Demeter as barley water mixed with pennyroyal. In 1978, ethnobotanist R. Gordon Wasson, chemist Albert Hofmann, the man who discovered lysergic acid, and classicist Karl Ruck proposed in The Road to Eleusis that the barley used in the kykeon was infected with ergot, a fungus that is the natural precursor to lysergic acid. For decades, this was treated as fringe speculation. Then in 2023, a study published in the journal Religions analyzed chemical residues inside a kykeon vessel recovered from the site at Eleusis and confirmed the presence of beta-carbolin alkaloids, naturally occurring psychoactive compounds consistent with exactly that hypothesis. At least 3 Roman emperors, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, and Commodus, were personally initiated. Augustus reportedly wept after his initiation and funded a full restoration of the sanctuary. Classical scholars largely accept the mysteries as a sophisticated religious drama built around the myth of Persephone's descent into the underworld and return. The experience of death and rebirth in this view was produced by powerful theatrical staging. Darkness, torchlight, sacred objects dramatically revealed, and emotionally charged ritual performance. The secrecy is attributed to religious law and deep cultural reverence for sacred tradition. These are reasonable explanations, and they account for a great deal, but theatrical staging does not produce what Plato described. In Phaedo, he writes as if what he witnessed directly informed his philosophy of the immortal soul, not as metaphor, but as something observed. And a drama, however carefully constructed, does not hold its secret across 1,900 years and hundreds of thousands of participants drawn from every corner of the known world. Secrets leak. This one didn't. Whatever was experienced in that chamber was apparently too destabilizing or too sacred to risk translating into words. If the kykeon was ergotized, and the chemical evidence now suggests it may have been, then the Eleusinian Mysteries were supposedly the longest-running and most socially sophisticated pharmacological ritual in human history. Not a performance, but a controlled encounter with something the participants consistently described as the structure of death itself, which raises a question that some researchers find deeply uncomfortable. What exactly did Plato, Cicero, and Marcus Aurelius see in that chamber that they spent the rest of their lives trying to describe in philosophy? Because they were forbidden from describing it directly. Top 2. The Aztec New Fire Ceremony. From a chamber where the elite of the ancient world went to confront death, we crossed the Atlantic to a hilltop in Mexico, where an entire empire gathered in total darkness, waiting to find out whether the sun would rise again. The Aztec New Fire Ceremony. Every fire in the empire has been extinguished. Not a single hearth, not one temple flame, not a single torch across millions of people spread over hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. Complete civilization-wide darkness. You have been told that if the priest on the hilltop above you cannot drill fire from a human chest before dawn, the stars will descend and the world will end. You wait. The Pleiades have not yet reached the zenith. You have been waiting for hours. The hill was called Huixatlan, the Hill of the Star, just outside the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in what is now Mexico City. The ceremony was called Toxumolpili, and its last fully documented performance took place in 1507 CE. It is recorded in extraordinary detail by the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún in the Florentine Codex completed in 1577, and by the Dominican friar Diego Duran in his Book of the Gods and Rites, written between 1576 and 1579. Both worked from indigenous informants with living memory of the event. The Aztec Codex Borbonicus preserves the calendar framework that governed when the ceremony was required. The Aztec calendar operated on two simultaneous cycles, a 365-day solar year and a 260-day ritual year, which synchronized only once every 52 years. That convergence point was called the Shumolpili, and it represented the moment when the current world either continued or ended. Sahagún describes in the Florentine Codex that at the close of each cycle, all hearthstones were thrown out, all household idols discarded, and all fires extinguished across the entire empire. A total ritual erasure of everything that had existed before. Duran records that pregnant women were masked in maguey leaves to prevent them transforming into demons if the sun failed to rise, suggesting the theological stakes were understood as literal rather than symbolic. The ceremony could not begin until the Pleiades star cluster reached the exact zenith of the sky at midnight. The priests on the hilltop functioned as astronomers, and the stellar alignment determined whether the ritual was permitted to proceed at all. When it did proceed, the new fire was drilled into the chest of a sacrificial victim, selected specifically for the omen of his birth sign. The flame was kindled in the opened chest cavity and then carried by runners to every corner of the empire. Alfonso Caso's archaeological excavation of the Hill of the Star in the 1940s confirmed ceremonial burning and votive deposits entirely consistent with the described ritual. And the ceremony also required the breaking and disposal of all ceramic vessels across the empire, one of the largest coordinated acts of voluntary material destruction in human history, executed simultaneously across millions of people in the dark. Archaeologists and anthropologists explain the new fire ceremony as a sophisticated state ritual designed to reinforce imperial authority and renew the social contract between the population and the priestly ruling class. The genuine cosmological anxiety at the end of the 52-year cycle was real within Aztec theology, and the ceremony served to publicly reset the relationship between humanity and the gods. The coordinated extinction of fire in this view demonstrates the remarkable administrative reach of the Aztec state, rather than anything beyond it. But administrative reach does not explain the astronomical precision. The Pleiades zenith calculation was not a prop the ceremony adapted to suit itself. It was the condition that determined whether the ceremony could begin at all. The ritual was built to serve the astronomy, not the other way around. And that raises a question some researchers believe has not been fully examined. What did the Aztec astronomer priests know about that specific 52-year interval that made them certain enough to stake the continuation of the world that the calculation would always hold? The Shumolpili cycle aligns with Venus's astronomical cycle in ways suggesting the Aztec priests tracked planetary motion with a precision we still have not fully mapped. The Spanish arrived in 1519, 12 years before the next reckoning would have fallen. We may never know what the Aztec court made of that timing, but the question hangs in the air above that darkened hilltop like smoke. Top 3, the Inca, Capacocha. From a hilltop in Mexico where fire was reborn from a human chest, we climbed thousands of meters higher to where the Inca carried what they considered their most precious offering to the very edge of the sky, the Inca Capacocha. She was approximately 13 years old. She had been selected from her village, honored, feasted, dressed in the finest cloth her civilization produced, and told she was going to live with the gods. She climbed to the summit of one of the highest mountains in the world. Then she sat down, and she never stood up again. 500 years later, archaeologists found her exactly where they had left her. Skin intact, hair still braided, last meal still in her stomach. Her expression carrying something that every researcher who has studied her face has described the same way. She looked like she had simply fallen asleep. The mountain was Lulailaco volcano in Salta province, Argentina, at 6,139 millimeters above sea level, the highest archaeological site ever discovered anywhere on Earth. The girl known as the Maiden was found on March 16, 1999, by a joint Argentine-Peruvian expedition led by archaeologist Johann Reinhard and anthropologist Constanza Cerruti. She was not alone. Two other children were found with her, a boy and a girl, each approximately 7 years old, known as the Boy and the Lightning Girl. Together, the three Lulailico children remain among the best-preserved human remains ever recovered anywhere in the world. A landmark study analyzing their hair chemistry was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2013 by Andrew Wilson and colleagues at the University of Bradford. The hair analysis told a story the ceremonial record had only partially preserved. It traced the maiden's diet for the final 12 months of her life, and it revealed a sharp, measurable increase in coca and alcohol consumption as her death approached. Her coca consumption increased by approximately 400% in the year before she died, with the largest spike concentrated in her final weeks. The study confirmed she died of exposure while sedated. No physical trauma, no sign of struggle, no indication in her tissue or her posture of anything resembling fear. Her clothing was made from kumbi cloth, woven at 120 threads per centimeter, the highest status textile in the Inca Empire, worn exclusively by royalty and deities. She had been dressed in every measurable sense as a god. The Capacocha ceremonies were timed to specific imperial events. The death of a Sapa Inca, a coronation, or a military victory, as documented by Cristobal de Molina in his Relación de las Fábulas y Ritos de los Incas, written around 1575. And these were not isolated events. Johann Reinhard's ongoing survey of Andean summits has documented over 115 high-altitude Inca ceremonial sites across 6 countries, establishing the Capacocha as a systematic empire-wide practice enacted at the highest possible altitudes the human body can reach. Archaeologists and anthropologists understand the Capacocha as the Inca's most sacred form of offering, reserved for the most significant imperial transitions. The children were understood not as victims, but as divine messengers, and their selection was considered an honor for their families and communities who received elevated social status in return. The ritual reflects the Inca cosmological belief that the mountain spirits, the apus, required the most precious possible gift. The use of coca and chicha was consistent with ceremonial practice across Andean cultures broadly. But the isotope data contains something the ceremonial framing cannot fully contain: the escalating sedation over 12 months, not hours or days, but an entire year, suggests the Inca had developed a pharmacological protocol for managing a child through a prolonged preparation for death. That is not ceremony alone. That is medical knowledge applied to ritual purpose with a precision that is still measurable 5 centuries later in a single strand of hair. According to some researchers, the question the isotope data raises is not whether this happened. It is this: who designed that protocol? How did they refine it across generations? And what else did the Inca understand about the chemistry of human consciousness that we have not yet found written down anywhere? We may never recover that knowledge, but the maiden is still there at 6,739 millimeter with the answer locked in her tissue. Top 4. The Bog Body Rituals. From the highest sacrificial sites in the world, we descend all the way below the surface of the earth into the dark water of northern Europe, where the bogs kept their dead in a different and equally impossible way: the bog body rituals. When Danish peat cutters found him in 1950, he looked like he was sleeping. Eyes closed, expression at rest, a leather cap still on his head. The police were called because he seemed recent. He wasn't. He had been lying in the bog for roughly 2,300 years, and around his neck was a braided leather noose, pulled so tight it had compressed his throat into a permanent narrowing. Someone had killed him carefully and then placed him in the water with something that looked to every forensic investigator who ever studied him less like disposal and more like arrangement. He was found in Tallinn Fen in Jutland, Denmark, and he is known as Tallinn Mon. Archaeologist Peter Glob led the subsequent investigation detailed in his book, The Bog People, published in 1969. A second body, Lindo Man, was found on August 1st, 1984, in Lindo Moss, Cheshire, England, by commercial peat cutters. Forensic analysis was conducted by Don Brothwell of the Natural History Museum in London. Over the following decades, anthropologist Miranda Aldhouse Green synthesized the broader pattern across hundreds of European finds in her book, Dying for the Gods, published in 2001. The pattern that emerged was not the pattern of a crime, it was the pattern of a ceremony. More than 700 bog bodies have now been documented across Northern Europe in a survey initiated by Alfred Deek and subsequently expanded by multiple scholarly teams. Tallinn Mon had consumed a last meal identified by botanist Hans Hellbeck as a specific porridge of barley, linseed, and wild plant seeds, a mixture with no nutritional advantage, suggesting its content was symbolic rather than practical. Lindo Man, radiocarbon dated to approximately 2 BCE through 119 CE, died from 3 simultaneous causes: a blow to the skull, strangulation, and throat cutting. Don Brothwell described the combination as deliberate overkill, a level of redundancy that could only be intentional. Analysis also confirmed that Lindo Man had consumed mistletoe pollen in his final hours, a plant held sacred in the Druidic tradition. Grobala Man, dated to approximately 310 through 55 BCE in Denmark, had his throat cut from ear to ear with a single precise stroke, and his hands showed no defensive wounds and no calluses. He had not spent his life doing physical labor. Miranda Aldhouse Green identified a consistent pattern across 12 bog bodies of deliberate, staged positioning at the bog's edge. Always face up, always placed at the boundary between land and water, always with what she described as care. Hair analysis of the eyed girl found in the Netherlands and dated to approximately 54 BCE through 128 CE revealed alternating periods of poor and good nutrition extending months before her death, suggesting a prolonged ritual preparation rather than a sudden killing. And the last meals of multiple bog bodies were found to contain the same mixture of inedible wild plants, seeds that grow only on disturbed or burned ground. A botanical consistency across centuries in geography that no one has fully explained. Archaeologists and anthropologists generally interpret the bog body killings as either judicial execution, punishment for transgression in societies that use bogs as sacred disposal sites, or ritual sacrifice connected to Iron Age agricultural fertility rites. Tacitus, writing in Germania around 98 CE, recorded that Germanic peoples disposed of cowards and those who had disgraced themselves in bogs, which has served as the primary textual anchor for the criminal execution theory. These are coherent explanations grounded in documented evidence. But Tacitus's criminals don't have manicured hands. They don't eat ritually specific last meals prepared with inedible plants. They don't wear expensive cloaks, and they are not killed 3 times simultaneously. A level of procedural coordination that requires multiple practitioners working from the same formula, not improvising. According to some researchers, including Ann Ross and Don Robbins in The Life and Death of a Druid Prince, published in 1989, certain bog bodies may have been willing or semi-willing sacrifices. Individuals whose ritualized death was understood as a gift to the land rather than a punishment extracted from a criminal. If that interpretation holds, the bogs are not crime scenes. They are something stranger. Archives of a theology in which the highest possible act of devotion was the structured offering of the most valuable thing available. The question that remains, and that we may never answer, is what institution was transmitting that formula across centuries and hundreds of kilometers, holding the triple death, the specific last meal, and the careful placement constant across generations of practitioners who never left a single written record. Top 5. The Scythian Death Ritual. From Northern Europe's dark water, we travel east to the high steppe of Central Asia, where a Greek historian recorded a ritual so precise that scholars dismissed it as fantasy for 2,000 years until the archaeology confirmed every detail. The Scythian Death Ritual. Around 440 BCE, the Greek historian Herodotus wrote down something he had either witnessed or been told by reliable sources, and nobody believed him for a very long time. He described a funeral for a Scythian king that involved strangling the king's servants, mounting their bodies on dead horses in a ring around the burial mound, and then sealing the mourners inside a small felt tent stretched over a frame of 3 sticks, pouring hemp seeds onto heated stones until the smoke inside the tent drove the occupants to cry out with pleasure. Scholars called it Greek exaggeration. Then archaeologists opened the mounds, and what they found inside was not exaggeration. It was a field report. The Scythians were nomadic pastoralists who dominated the Eurasian steppe from roughly 700 through 300 BCE, ranging from the Black Sea coast to the Altai Mountains of what is now Siberia. Their dead were buried in earthen mounds called kurgans, and the kurgans preserved what no written record had been trusted to convey. Soviet archaeologist Sergei Rudenko excavated the Pazyryk kurgans in the Altai Mountains beginning in 1947 and found something inside Pazyryk kurgan 2 that made the Herodotus passage suddenly completely legible. A bronze cauldron containing hemp seeds, a low framework of sticks matching the tent description exactly, and leather coverings consistent with Herodotus's account in every architectural detail. A description written in Greece in the 5th century BCE had just been confirmed by physical evidence 2,400 years later. In 2017, German and Russian archaeologists excavating a Scythian burial site in the Caucasus published a chemical analysis of 2 ornate gold vessels in the journal Science Advances. The residue inside both vessels confirmed the simultaneous presence of cannabis and opium, suggesting the ritual may have combined multiple psychoactive substances in a single preparation rather than cannabis alone. At the Arjan Kurgan in Tuva, Russia, studied by Konstantin Chugunov, archaeologists found 14 human sacrifices buried with the king and 160 horses arranged in concentric rings around the burial, consistent with Herodotus's account of the scale of a Scythian royal funeral in every measurable detail. Accelerator mass spectrometry analysis of horse remains at multiple kurgan sites confirmed that the animals were killed simultaneously, not buried gradually over time, confirming the ritual mass sacrifice rather than a cumulative accumulation. The Pazyryk kurgans also preserved cannabis fiber textiles, suggesting the plant held a central place in Scythian material culture that extended well beyond the funerary context. Renate Rolla in The World of the Scythians, published in 1989, documented that the mounted servant burials, bodies of strangled retainers placed on dead horses around the perimeter of the king's grave, were confirmed at multiple sites across the steppe in exactly the formation Herodotus described. Historians and archaeologists now accept the Scythian funerary practices as confirmed. The cannabis ritual is understood as a mourning and purification ceremony in which altered consciousness served to process the death of the king and facilitate transition between worlds. The horse and human sacrifices reflected Scythian beliefs in an afterlife, requiring the king to arrive equipped with everything he possessed in life. The specific ritual form was shaped by the practical and symbolic logic of steppe nomadic culture, and the confirmation of Herodotus is treated as a remarkable but ultimately bounded archaeological vindication. But the confirmation of Herodotus raises a question historians have been slower to engage with. If he was precisely right about the cannabis tent, precisely right about the mounted servants, and precisely right about the horse rings, what else in Book 4 of the Histories, which also contains accounts of Scythian practices involving strange creatures guarding gold to the east and peoples living beyond the north wind, deserves a less reflexively dismissive second reading? According to some researchers, including Rolla, the cannabis ritual may not have been purely funerary. It may have represented an ongoing consciousness practice, a method supposedly for maintaining communication with the dead king across the boundary of death through sustained altered states. If the tent and the hemp formed a complete system for reaching someone who was no longer alive, the question becomes not whether the technology worked as intended, but what the Scythians believed they were receiving from the other side, and how many times they believed it had worked before. Top 6. The Tibetan Churd Ritual. From a ritual designed to reach the dead through smoke and vapor, we travel south to Tibet, where a ritual designed to destroy the self entirely has been performed alone at midnight in graveyards with instruments made from human bone for the last 9 centuries. The Tibetan Chod ritual. It is midnight. You are alone in a graveyard in Tibet, and you are holding a trumpet made from a human thigh bone in one hand and a small drum made from two conjoined human skulls in the other. You begin to play. Then, using a visualization technique refined over 9 centuries, you mentally disassemble your own body piece by piece and offer it to the demons you have summoned, inviting them to consume you completely. The goal is not to survive the experience intact. The goal is to emerge with nothing left that fear can attach to. The ritual is called chod, meaning to cut in Tibetan, and it was systematized by a female mystic named Machig Labdrun, who lived from approximately 1055 to 1149 CE and transmitted the practice through a lineage that continues to the present day. The first extensive Western documentation came from French-Belgian explorer Alexandre David Niel, who witnessed and partially underwent Chod training in Tibet during the 1910s and 20s, and published her accounts in Magic and Mystery in Tibet in 1929. Scholarly analysis was later advanced by Jeffrey Samuel in Civilized Shamans in 1993, and by Sarah Harding's translation of Mashig's Complete Explanation in 2003. The instruments used in chod are not metaphorical. The kangling, the thigh-bone trumpet, is traditionally made from the femur of a person who died violently or of disease specifically to invoke the reality of death rather than its representation. Confirmed examples dating to the 17th century are held in the collection of the Rubin Museum of Art in New York. The damaru, the skull drum, is traditionally constructed from the conjoined skulls of a male and female who died simultaneously, symbolizing the union of opposites at the moment of dissolution. David Nail confirmed she witnessed practitioners using genuine human bone instruments during her time in Tibet. She also documented a practitioner performing chod continuously for 7 days in a charnel ground with no food or sleep, emerging with psychological changes she could not account for through any framework available to her at the time. The full textual tradition of chod is preserved in the Jihad Bke Ekachom score, translated by Sarah Harding, and the visualization instructions it contains are precise enough to constitute a replicable psychological procedure, specific enough that modern researchers, including work reviewed in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology, have identified structural parallels between chod visualization techniques and contemporary exposure therapy protocols for treating severe fear disorders and trauma. Jeffrey Samuel documented in Civilized Shamans that chod was specifically designed to be practiced in places of maximum psychological fear. Charnel grounds, execution sites, places associated with plague, because the ritual only functions when genuine terror is present as its raw material. Not simulated terror, but the real thing. And Machig Labdrun holds a distinction unique in the entire history of Buddhist transmission. She is the only Tibetan teacher ever to have created a tradition that was transmitted back to India from Tibet, reversing the normal direction of exchange. Indian scholars reportedly recognized her teachings as more advanced than the existing Indian practice, a judgment with no precedent in Buddhist intellectual history. Religious scholars explain chod as a Vajrayana, Buddhist meditation technique rooted in the Prajnaparamita, perfection of wisdom, philosophical tradition. The visualization of offering one's body to demons is understood as an exercise designed to dissolve attachment to ego and physical form, confronting impermanence at close range. The human bone instruments in charnel ground settings serve the psychological function of forcing practitioners into unmediated contact with death, consistent with Buddhist contemplative goals. It is in this framework sophisticated spiritual psychology operating within a coherent theological tradition. But the mainstream explanation and the practitioners themselves describe the same goal in nearly identical terms, and neither can fully account for what the practice consistently produces. From medieval Tibetan masters to 20th century Western observers, documented accounts across 9 centuries describe the same result: an encounter with something in the charnel ground that practitioners consistently experience as not generated by their own imagination. Whether that consistency reflects a shared neurological response to specific inputs, bone instrument frequencies, genuine terror, sleeplessness, isolation, or something that has no name in the vocabulary we currently have. Some researchers believe the question deserves more rigorous examination than it has received. If Chod represents, as Jeffrey Samuel has proposed, an ancient shamanic consciousness technology that Machig Labdrin encoded within a Buddhist philosophical framework to preserve it across the centuries, then the question becomes, how old is the core technology? And what was it before she found it? Because what she transmitted has survived intact for 900 years. And something that durable is usually durable for a reason. Top 7, the Taurobolium. From the midnight cemeteries of the Himalayas, we travel west to the sun-drenched empire of Rome, where a ritual that predates Christianity by 2 centuries was being performed in a pit of blood, using the same theological vocabulary promising the same eternal outcome. The Taurobolium. You climb down into a pit dug in the earth. The walls are close, the air is still, and above you, a wooden grating has been laid across the opening. A bull is led onto the grating, a consecrated spear is raised, and then the blood comes. Not a symbolic anointing, not a sprinkle of sacred water, but the full arterial flood of a dying animal pouring through the gaps above you, soaking your hair, your upturned face, your open mouth. You stand in it until it stops. Then you climb out. You are, in the language carved into the stone that will be erected to commemorate this moment, in eternum renatus, reborn for eternity. Hundreds of those stones still exist. They predate the first Christian baptism by at least 2 centuries. The ritual was called the Taurobolium, and it was performed at sanctuaries dedicated to Cybele, the Great Mother, across the Roman Empire. The practice is documented in over 100 surviving Latin inscriptions concentrated in southern Gaul, Spain, and Rome, and catalogued in the Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum. The most detailed literary account was provided by the Christian poet Prudentius in his Parastephanon, written around 405 CE, describing the pit, the wooden grating, the sacrificed bull, and the blood immersion in physical terms specific enough to allow architectural reconstruction of the ritual space. The foundational scholarly synthesis was produced by Martin Vermasren in Cybele and Attis, published in 1977. The cult of Cybele was officially introduced to Rome by the Senate in 204 BCE, making it one of the oldest state-sanctioned mystery religions in Roman history, predating Christianity by more than 2 centuries. The inscriptions recording Taurobolium initiations use the formula in Eternum Renatus consistently from the 3rd century onward. Reborn for eternity through blood, through immersion, through ritual death and emergence. The Galli, the priests of Cybele, underwent ritual castration as part of their own initiation, understood as a permanent physical reenactment of the death and rebirth of Attis, Cybele's consort, a transformation with no parallel in any other Roman priestly tradition. Tertullian, writing around 200 CE, explicitly accused the devil of having preemptively inspired the Mithraic and Cybele mystery cults to imitate Christian sacraments, an accusation that, without appearing to notice the problem, confirms that early Christians fully recognized the theological parallel and were troubled enough by the chronology to require a supernatural explanation for it. Emperor Julian the Apostate, in his attempt to revive paganism against the rising Christian state between 361 and 363 CE, wrote extensively about the theological meaning of the Taurobolium, describing it as a genuine mystery of death and rebirth, suggesting the ritual retained full theological seriousness well into the 4th century. An archaeological excavation beneath the Vatican itself confirmed the presence of a Phrygianum, a sanctuary of Cybele, directly beneath St. Peter's Basilica, establishing that the site was considered sacred to the Great Mother before it was sacred to the Christian tradition. Classical scholars explain the Taurobolium as one of several mystery religions offering personal salvation and rebirth that flourished across the Roman Empire during the 1st through 4th centuries CE. The theological parallels with Christianity are attributed to a shared cultural environment. The Roman world was saturated with dying and rising mythology, and multiple traditions independently developed similar frameworks for articulating spiritual transformation. The Taurobolium represents sophisticated Roman engagement with Eastern religious ideas, not a precursor to or imitation of anything that came after it. But the Vatican was built directly over a Cybelist sanctuary. The vocabulary is identical. The ritual structure is identical. The chronology is unambiguous. The blood rebirth formula predates Christian baptism by at minimum 2 centuries. At some point, according to some researchers, independent parallel development becomes a taxonomy invented to avoid a more uncomfortable question. What were both traditions pointing at that required this specific structure? Blood, death, immersion, rebirth, eternal life. The Torabolium inscriptions recorded new births in eternum as late as 376 CE, 15 years before Theodosius banned pagan sacrifice in 391 CE. What happened to the initiates, the theology, and the underground sanctuaries in those 15 years between the last inscription and the prohibition? We may never fully know, but the stones are still there, and they still say what they say. Top 8. The Vedic Ashvamedha. From Rome's blood pits, we travel east to ancient India, where the most powerful ritual in the Vedic tradition claims sovereignty not over a city, not over an empire, but over the entire known world, and did so for over 3,000 years. The Vedic Ashvamedha. A stallion is consecrated, then it is released for exactly 1 year. It walks wherever it chooses across the subcontinent, and behind it follows an army. Every king whose territory the horse enters must choose: submit to the man who released it or fight his forces in the field. After 12 months, the horse comes home. It is sacrificed in a ceremony described across several hundred verses of the Shatapatha Brahmana, with a procedural specificity that made every Western scholar who translated it deeply uncomfortable. The chief queen spends one ritual night beside the body of the slaughtered animal. Then a king becomes, by the theological logic of the most sacred tradition in Vedic religion, the master of the world. The Ashvamedha is attested from approximately 1500 BCE in the Rig Veda and is described in forensic detail across 3 major Vedic texts: the Rig Veda in Book 1, hymns 162-163, the Yajur Veda in chapters 22-25, and most extensively in the Shatapatha Brahmana, chapters 13:1 to 13:5, which provides step-by-step ritual instructions running to approximately 400 individual procedural directives. Archaeological evidence, charred horse bones in ritual fire pits, was excavated at Kalibangan in Rajasthan by B.K. Thapar of the Archaeological Survey of India during campaigns conducted in the 1960s. The ritual's procedural architecture is not arbitrary. It requires 16 Ritvik priests in specific assigned roles, 17 sacrificial stakes, and 360 pots of soma, numbers that correspond precisely to the divisions of the Vedic calendar year, suggesting the entire ceremony was understood as a reenactment of cosmic time rather than a political demonstration. The Rig Veda hymns, translated by Wendy Doniger in the Rig Veda, an anthology, published in 1981, identify the horse's body explicitly with the entire cosmos. Its breath is the wind, its eye is the sun, its limbs are the divisions of the year. The B.K. Thapar excavations at Kalibangan tentatively dated the fire altar complex with horse bones to approximately 2500 BCE, potentially pushing the ritual's origin back a full 1,000 years before the Rig Veda's composition, suggesting it may have been inherited by the Vedic tradition from something considerably older. Historical records confirm performances by Pushyamitra Shunga in 185 BCE, by Samudragupta of the Gupta Empire in the 4th century CE, who minted gold coins depicting the sacrificed horse with inscriptions claiming world sovereignty. Coins now held in the British Museum and the Indian Museum in Kolkata, and finally by Jai Singh II of the Maratha Empire in 1741 CE during the European Enlightenment, 2 decades before the American Revolution. That final performance makes the documented tradition of this single ritual approximately 3,200 years long by the most conservative estimate. Vedic scholars explain the Ashvamedha as the supreme expression of Vedic cosmological and political thought, a ceremony in which the king temporarily becomes the cosmic sovereign by reenacting the original act of creation. The horse's year of free wandering maps the king's territorial claim across geographic space, and its sacrifice returns that claim to the cosmos from which it was drawn. The ritual's sexual component is understood as a fertility rite, ensuring the prosperity of the kingdom. Its 3,000-year continuity reflects its function as the ultimate legitimizing ceremony for any ruler claiming paramount authority. But Vedic scholar Jan Heisterman, analyzing the archaic layers of the Brahmana texts in The Inner Conflict of Tradition, published in 1985, argued that the ceremony as we have it shows the seams of an older, considerably more direct ritual that was reformatted but not fully erased across centuries of priestly editing. The texts we have are, according to Heisterman, already the sanitized version. What was removed from the original, and why the priestly tradition found it necessary to place that distance between the ceremony and its origins? These are questions the texts themselves raise without answering. Some researchers have proposed that the Ashvamedha preserves in elaborately encoded form a memory of a far older kingship tradition in which the right to rule was not inherited but physically proven, and in which what the queen did beside the horse was the actual territorial claim made flesh rather than its symbolic representation. Heisterman went further, arguing the Vedic priestly tradition had sublimated an older system in which the king himself, not a horse, was the central offering. If he is right, the 3,000-year history of the Ashvamedha is not simply the history of a ceremony, it is the history of a civilization placing careful, methodical distance between itself and something it once did directly, but never entirely letting it go. Top 9. The Skidi Pawnee Morning Star Ceremony. From a ritual that claimed the entire world, we crossed the Pacific to the Great Plains of North America, where a ceremony claimed something even larger, ran on a schedule set by the planets, and required its practitioners to track the orbit of Mars with naked-eye precision across multiple years. The Skidi Pawnee Morning Star Ceremony. Long before dawn, they tie a young woman to a scaffold facing east. She has been captured in a raid and treated with ceremony and respect for months, fed well, clothed in ritual garments, given every reason to believe she has been honored. As the morning star rises to a specific position on the eastern horizon, the ceremony begins. What follows is over in seconds. What preceded it took months of calculation because the ceremony could not happen on just any morning. It required a specific planet, Mars, to be in a specific relationship with another, Venus. And the Skidi Pawnee had been tracking that relationship with naked eyes across years. The Morning Star ceremony is documented with extraordinary ethnographic precision by James R. Murray, a Pawnee scholar of partial Skidi descent, who recorded the full ritual procedures, songs, cosmological context, and sacred bundle contents between 1912 and 1921. His work was published posthumously as Ceremonies of the Pawnee by the Smithsonian Institution Press in 1981. Astronomical analysis of the ceremony's timing was conducted by Von Del Chamberlain in When Stars Came Down to Earth, Cosmology of the Skidi Pawnee Indians of North America, published in 1982. The last confirmed performance was the killing of a 14-year-old Oglala Lakota girl in 1838, witnessed by missionary John Dunbar, whose account was later published in the Kansas Historical Quarterly. Mars completes its synodic period, the interval between successive identical positions relative to the Earth, in approximately 780 days, nearly 2 years and 3 months. Scheduling a ceremony to coincide with a specific Martian morning appearance requires maintaining a continuous observational record of planetary positions across multiple years. Chamberlain's analysis confirmed that the ceremony was timed to the morning appearance of Mars after solar conjunction, ideally when Mars was near maximum brightness and approaching Venus in the pre-dawn sky. The Skidi possessed the tools to make that calculation. A painted buffalo hide, now in the collection of the Field Museum in Chicago, is one of the only confirmed pre-contact Native American astronomical maps, depicting the Pleiades, Orion's Belt, the Milky Way, and specific bright stars in configurations consistent with Skidi cosmological tradition. Murray recorded 16 distinct ritual songs associated with the ceremony, each corresponding to a specific procedural phase of the preparation, a level of musical and procedural codification comparable in structure to the Vedic Shatapatha Brahmana. Chamberlain identified that the morning star in Skidi cosmology was understood as a warrior figure who had created the world by capturing and sacrificing the evening star, meaning the human ceremony was not understood as a sacrifice to a deity, but as a reenactment of the original creative act of the cosmos. John Dunbar's 1838 eyewitness account describes the scaffold construction, the victim's posture, the bow shot, and the subsequent ritual in details consistent with every point in Murray's ethnographic record, gathered 65 years later from informants who had no access to Dunbar's account. And Chief Petalasharo had personally intervened in 1817 to rescue a captive woman by cutting her from the scaffold and carrying her away on horseback, an act celebrated in American newspapers and rewarded by President Monroe with a silver medal. Yet the ceremony continued for another 21 years after his intervention. Anthropologists and historians explain the Morning Star ceremony as a complex cosmological ritual in which the Skidi reenacted the mythological creation of the world through the sacred confrontation of celestial forces. The astronomical timing reflects sophisticated indigenous knowledge of planetary cycles, developed through generations of systematic sky observation. The ceremony renewed cosmic and agricultural fertility, connecting the human community to the foundational creative act encoded in Skidi theology. But the astronomical precision required to identify Mars's specific morning appearance after solar conjunction and to schedule a ceremony months in advance to coincide with it demands a multi-year planetary almanac. Chamberlain confirmed the Skidi had exactly that, which means a community in Nebraska was maintaining a continuous record of planetary motion, sophisticated enough to schedule a human death to the day using the same logical framework as the astronomer priests of every advanced ancient civilization. Chamberlain also identified parallels between the Skidi cosmological system and Mesopotamian astral mythology that he could not fully explain through contact theory. Whether those parallels reflect convergent development, a deeper shared substrate of astronomical mythology that predates the geographic separation of the cultures, or something else entirely, some researchers believe that question has not received the examination it deserves. The Skidi star chart is still at the Field Museum. It still matches the sky, and the ceremony it governed is over. The knowledge that produced it mostly gone, the last practitioner long dead. We may never recover what was in the calculation, but we can still read what it required.